Just before we start, can everyone give a quick 20 seconds on their reaction to the last 24 hours?
I've been around since 2011, so I was around when the Mt. Gox scandal happened. And I do think this is worse than Mt. Gox, because everyone you would expect less for FTX to be insolvent than Mt. Gox after like many different years of people learning about Mt. Gox.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen. Like I come from traditional finance, and we've seen this like happen a lot there, so it doesn't really surprise me. But I think the thing that I can't stop getting out of my head is when Celsius and Three Arrows happened, how SBF was just in as much trouble as them, but tweeting, I'm going on an acquisition spree, and we're really well capitalized, so we're going to start acquiring. Call me if you need, a bailout, basically. And that's the part I keep coming back to that. I'm like, wow.
Do you think it's good we've recreated the traditional financial system?
No, you're talking to the DeFi person in the room, so of course not. No.
I feel like shaken, like almost physically nauseous. I don't know. I don't think that's happened before, so I think it's a really big one. The thing that surprises me is that the exchange itself is kind of a profitable business, right? You've got a good business there, and when we take on development projects, and we speak a lot to clients about token models, right? And do they need a token, and why they're using blockchain, and so on. So we go through a lot of that with clients and try and tease out, where's the real value, and do you really need it, and what's the real model, and so on. And I'm really surprised. I really learned about FTT, what happened in the last couple of days. I wasn't really aware of it. But a business like that, why does it really need the token, and what does it serve, and what's the real value of it? And then how did it become such a big part of the underlying value? So that's kind of the shocker for me, is you've got such a good business, why? Why?
Very good question. So kind of on that note, Mola, what can we learn about the failures of centralized exchanges, and how does this apply to DeFi?
I mean, I'll talk to centralized finance in general, not just exchanges, but, the problem with centralized finance in general is that you don't have transparency. And no matter what anyone tells you, you don't understand, you never know for certain whether your assets are backed one for one on exchange. And you never know what the exchange is really doing with your assets in the background. You just have no look through. And what can we learn? I don't know how many years people have been in crypto, but for those of us, I think Adi alluded to it at the beginning of his presentation. Many of us who got into this space early, one of the things we were very attracted to blockchain for was the non-custodial aspect, the idea that your keys, your assets, and no one can really take those away from you. And decentralized exchanges mean that you always have your assets in your custody, and these kind of things can't happen. You'll always have full transparency. You can always see where things are, where your transaction is. So I just think that I thought it with Three Arrows and Celsius too, but that was a big lesson for me, for the world, that don't just trust. You can't just be so trusting of people. You have to be able to see through. When people, you made a comment, why did they need to do this when FTX was a solid business? Maybe it wasn't. How do we know that? FTX was, and then the other thing is greed, right? Greed always comes into the equation. We've seen it time and time and time again, and that's never going to go away. So I think the nice thing about DeFi is that you get the transparency, and because you have the transparency, market can question, market can regulate you, market can expose you, and because you can have that people publicly exposing you, you can get to the bottom of something much quicker rather than let things get this big and that get this disastrous.
I want to add, I heard in a panel today at Token 2049, someone was asked about this, and they said, how could it happen, and so on. And they said that the technology hasn't come far enough. Right? The technology's still got a long way to go. And I think, as a techie, I think the technology does a lot, right? I think it's going to bring us a lot more than we have today in today's financial system, right? A lot more security, efficiency, and so on. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't, unless you understand it, then it doesn't, bridge this gap between what people think it does or might explain and claim that they're doing versus what's actually happening on the ground, right? And that gap means that people think they're investing in something, they think a project works in a certain way, they see it's all tainted with blockchain, so it all works, does certain things. But actually this token worked very differently to tokens, let's say, in a DeFi protocol. And so you kind of need to understand the mechanics to actually know the difference between something that might be as safe as you think it is versus all the risks that are actually associated with it. And I don't know if there's a technical solution for that. Right?
You say it should be more education.
It's education. I mean, I hate to say the word regulation, right? Because I never thought that was necessarily a good thing in this context, because blockchain has certainly been about trying to solve things through the technology. But I think there's something there where people are using and abusing. Yeah.
When you're done.
Okay, but yeah, people are using the terminology and the terms and kind of the good stuff to put something out there and say, well, it's like that, but actually when you look at it, it isn't. And you need to know the difference.
I just I really feel very strongly about that last comment, because I don't think more regulation is the answer. If you just look at traditional finance, we've got so much regulation, but we keep having disaster there too. So, the reason we keep having blow-ups in traditional finance and centralized finance and DeFi is because regulators can't even get the transparency they need to spot bad behavior. So again, I think the answer is more DeFi, not more regulation, and actually less regulation, because when you have the transparency, it's much easier to spot bad actors, it's much easier to spot red flags, and as a result, you can sort of regulate the market much easier without needing to have regulation, like legal regulation.
I don't know what the answer is. Right? I'm just putting out. We had the same thing with Terra. Right? We actually wrote a report about Terra 6 months before it blew up. Somebody asked us to write a report about how you could insure Terra, and we looked at it closely and realised what might happen and described the steps. So if you looked at it, like the transparency was there to see that it was off tilt and what could happen, but the explanations weren't out there. And people putting money into it weren't always aware. Right? So the technology in Terra was working the way we'd expect it to on blockchain, but people didn't necessarily understand that.
But sorry. I just on the Terra thing, that was a great example of radical transparency. I don't think anyone can protect people against themselves making investment decisions, right? The information was there on Terra. Yeah. It was a flawed model from the start. We looked at it and we said, no, thank you. And all the information was there, but people still chose to rush it because they wanted the extra yield, or they got greedy. They knew that, many people knew it was flawed, but the transparency was there, and that's why it never lasted very long and it collapsed very quickly. But had it had been opaque, it could have gone on for years and been a much bigger disaster, I think.
I mean, Terra was a pretty huge disaster, don't you think?
Yeah, but it could have been much bigger. It could have gone on for years if you didn't have that transparency. If the white paper wasn't there, if you didn't have the model.
I think fundamentally, like a lot of the recent exchange and CeFi failures, like Voyager and BlockFi and FTX, are fundamentally because of the fact that they are custodial. And the question is, how do we make these systems non-custodial? Until a few years ago, until Uniswap came around, practical decentralized exchanges were a pipe dream. So now, before that, until Uniswap or the Nexus became a thing, the only options were centralized exchanges. You had to use a custodial solution. But now we do have a non-custodial solution. We have the decentralized exchanges. Now the question is why aren't users using them? And I think fundamentally it's a question of user experience. The fees are expensive. The UX is bad. You have to maintain your own private keys. But I think we are making significant progress there. Because layer 2, on a protocol level, exchanges like Coinbase and Kraken are basically sidechains. on a high level, but you can have non-custodial sidechains, and that's what rollups are on Ethereum, for example. You can have a rollup, you can have a decentralized exchange with lower fees on the rollup. And the solution is to improving the UX problem of private keys. So, for example, Argent tries to solve that problem with social recovery. So, last bull market we had DEXs. Before then, we didn't even have that option. Maybe next bull market, the UX will get so much better that centralized exchanges decentralized exchanges will compete way more with centralized exchanges.
Okay, so we said that like DeFi is kind of one solution here. But is DeFi safe and is it ready to use? I mean, last month we had Mango Markets, which was a huge hack. In fact, we had so many hacks last month that it was called Hacktober. Is this safe for people to put their money in?
I think everything is, users have to do their research when they're using things. I think it's fair to say there's a lot of DeFi that's not really DeFi, but branding as DeFi. And two, there's a lot of stuff that is out there that hasn't been audited, it's not battle tested, etc. But typically all of this is information, again, that if you look for it, you can read it. And by the way, most of the hacks that happen in DeFi, if you had read the audit report, they would have warned you against those risks. And some of the hacks that happen in DeFi, there were no audit reports. So if you're interacting with protocols that don't have audits or that don't have battle-tested history, yeah, you're gonna have much higher risk. I don't think though, the nice thing about DeFi is that you don't tend to have as much of these ripple effects, and also you don't have in the kind of liquidations you've had in the whole Celsius 3 arrows and what's probably going to come now with FTX and Alameda, the people who get paid back first are the DeFi users, because that's just automated and there's no lawyer or no person who can stop that happening.
And for Avantgarde, how does it generate yield?
Avantgarde is actually first and foremost a developer, a software engineering firm, and we are the core developers to Ensign protocol. But we have been building out an asset management business. We don't like to define DeFi as just yield. We think there's many opportunities in DeFi. We pride ourselves in doing a lot of deep research on every single protocol and putting it through an investment process, investment committee, risk management and sizing appropriately, so that if we are earning yield or looking at opportunities, we're risk managing it appropriately and hopefully avoiding more blow-ups than we are getting wins.
Yeah, and Eddie, you're speaking earlier about oracles. What's the kind of biggest challenge with oracles and kind of keeping DeFi protocols safe?
I think I presented it earlier as well when I showed how the oracles are structured. So a lot of applications, they're taking data from the regular Web 2 applications, bringing them into the Web 3 world. We need to have that cryptographic audit trail. Right? A smart contract needs to be able to verify because it's automated. So if it's going to move funds, something has to be true, otherwise those funds shouldn't move. So it needs to be built and structured in a way that has to be absolute. And so, again, just like everything else in this, the technology needs to be built and used in a certain way for those guarantees to be there.
Okay, and you also spoke about bridges. Like, what are kind of cross-chain and bridges? There's been a lot of difficulties, wormhole, a lot of money stolen. Is it possible to build a safe bridge?
Yeah, I mean, there's essentially two types of bridges. There's trusted bridges and trustless. Within that, there's lots of different categories, but those are two main categories. Trusted means that there's somebody in the middle, there's an operator, and because blockchains don't know how to talk to each other, that operator talks to one and says, I've seen this has happened over here, so I'm going to go and do that over there. And that operator is typically a non-blockchain, regular application. And it doesn't have all of that blockchain security. So people got really religious about their blockchains and how decentralized they are and how fast they are, but no one really looked at these bridges. And the bridges were carrying all the risk. and those assets were being sent across without all of that diligence. So the next generation, I think, is these trustless bridges, where the second blockchain won't do anything unless it has cryptographic guarantees that everything is correct from the first blockchain. So you need to, again, similar to the oracles, you need to kind of push through all of those guarantees, and they need to be fully verified on that second chain. That's how you solve it technically. Nothing is 100% in terms of security, but you take away some of the attack vectors by doing that.
Okay, and Mustafa, what is Celestia and what are modular blockchains?
Yeah, so the idea there is smart contract platforms like Ethereum or Solana. They have kind of like a world computer model where everyone is expected to deploy their application on the same blockchain. But we think like the Web3 is heading towards a world where you have multiple chains and application-specific chains. It's not realistic to assume there will be some smart contract platform that will like rule them all. In practice, we're going to have a multi-chain ecosystem. And the idea of modular blockchains is that instead of having to deploy your own layer 1 network every single time we deploy a new chain, we can decouple the layers of the blockchain stack. So for example, at Celestia, we decouple consensus from execution. So you can create your own execution environment on Celestia without having to deploy an entirely new consensus network. So like let's say you want to deploy, you can deploy, for example, like a Solana virtual machine rollup on Celestia without having to deploy a proof of stake network. And this will make it easier in the future for people to deploy their own chains or application-specific chains with less overhead because they don't have to create their own consensus network. They can just plug in a consensus network.
Okay, and is this similar to like Avalanche, which has its own kind of application-specific blockchains?
It's similar in the sense that it's a multi-chain vision, but it's different in the sense that like systems like Avalanche or Cosmos, they don't have shared security in the sense like each chain has its own economic security. But with modular blockchains, the idea is that your chain can inherit, even though you have your own chain, you can inherit security from another chain by plugging in another chain as a consensus and data availability layer. And that's how Ethereum rollups work, for example. When you deploy a rollup on Ethereum, it's inheriting security from the Ethereum base layer. So it's effectively modular.
Okay, and then Avantgarde wants to service DAOs. What are the kind of biggest challenges dealing with decentralized autonomous organizations?
Well, they move slower than more centralized organizations. You have to speak to more stakeholders. You have to get more stakeholders on board. Then often something will go to a token holder vote after a temperature check and a long debate in the community, and possibly everything is public and everybody is able to comment. And so rather than just reporting to one small team of people who kind of coordinate all their questions and ask them to you in one go, you're sort of dealing with this masses and masses of people, and you don't really understand where the conflicts exist, what the conflicts are. That can be slow and much more challenging. And then the other side of it is, I think that's the biggest thing. I think DAOs just make decision making. The bigger a DAO is, the more token holders, the more DAO stakeholders, the slower the decision making process is. And that's actually the trade-off. The more people, the less efficient. Fewer people, more efficient. I think that's generally a trade-off that's well understood. But in treasury management specifically, it's basically how do you manage assets of a DAO whilst not giving someone full control. So the DAO stays in custody of the assets while being able to delegate the day-to-day transactions management in a completely trustless way. That's something we can help them with. And also, how do you provide a complete, transparent, 24/7 reporting on-chain to your community? That is something that we can give DAOs day one. And I think that's something that helps make the lives of DAOs and treasury management much easier. We're trying to help promote that, especially in light of recent events.
Yeah, okay, and the last question before we go to the Q&A, and trying to tie it back more to the original title, what can we do, especially if FTX kicks us into a super long bear market, what can we do to be extra resilient and get through this?
Well, to be serious, there's a lot of things. I mean, cut costs, try and extend your runway as much as possible. Basically, build. Bear markets are the best time to build. This is our third bear market, or my third bear market. If you're building for the future, when the next bull market comes, you'll be perfectly positioned. It's all about survival during this time, because many projects won't survive if the worst happens. But if you do survive, hopefully you ride the next wave up and you're much stronger for it.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of big question here about how do you have a economically sustainable protocol or project? Because like a lot of projects, they just assume like a permanent bear market. That's why FTX failed. They assume that the token will go up forever. That this does not rely on like you selling tokens from your token treasury.
Yeah, I think similar things. So, as well as since 2015, I mean, two things we've learned. One is a lot more about the technology, but the other is how to build a resilient business. Because 2019 almost wiped us out. And right now, a lot of people are still building. There's still a lot of building going on. It feels very different, but it also depends how long it goes on for. I'm a big believer in the technology itself and the efficiencies that it brings. I think if you stick to that, if you stick to the fundamentals and you've got value, and I think that's always going to come through in the end.
Sure. So, do we have questions from the audience?
Take the microphone so I can take it down. But if you just get people to put hands up and I'll get.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got a mic coming.
Hi, thank you for your thoughts of today's panel. I had a question to Mustafa. Like you were talking about like a multi-chain future. Specifically to your project, is yours like kind of working with sidechains or is it all roll-up based?
Yeah, so it's generally roll-up based because roll-ups can kind of inherit a consensus layer. So that's what we're providing. We're providing a pluggable consensus layer for roll-ups.
Okay. And so is your intention to actually spin up a roll-up and then close it down afterwards again if it's not needed anymore?
Well, in general, the general use case is like permanent roll-ups, but there is also an interesting use case of like ephemeral roll-ups. Like that is a valid use case, and people have been discussing this idea of like temporary chains. Like maybe have like a financial transaction or a series of trades, or even like a game, for example, like let's say a battleship game that only needs a temporary state. You might set up a temporary roll or a temporary chain that then you shut down later.
And final question. So with Polkadot, we saw they also have a shared consensus model, but more like sidechain based, I would say. It's not really unlimited scalable because at one point this shared consensus is facing some scalability issues. How is it with rollups? Is it like really unlimited scalable? You could just spin up an unlimited number of rollups, or does it also has like some kind of limit?
Yeah, there's no such thing as a limited scale, but in Polkadot, the main difference is that the shared security model relies on the validators of the main chain executing transactions in the parachains. And so that means like the parachains have to compete for computational resources, but rollups work differently because the consensus layer or the base layer, they don't actually execute the rollup transactions. They only guarantee the data availability of the rollup transactions, which means that the rollups don't need to compete for computation from the base layer. The base layer is only responsible for data, not computation, which means it's inherently more. You can get inherently more throughput out of that.
So the scalability is kind of limited to the block space of Celestia itself.
Yeah, so data availability would be the bottleneck, but we can scale data availability way more because we only focus on data availability.
Cool. All right. Thank you.
Who answers the question? Donald. Cool.
Yeah, I've got a question for Mona about the treasury management. I feel like a lot of projects in DeFi over the last 18 months or so have kind of struggled with actually creating the best strategy for their treasuries. I feel like a lot have just held on to their own token in kind of a bias and a hope for kind of growth. Some were able to sell to stablecoins or other assets, but overall, I think that's a big space that your project can have an impact in the future with helping other protocols kind of do their treasury management. I'm curious if you have any thoughts or if you've thought about how you guys can impact and kind of work with other protocols to bring treasury management transparently on chain. So as a DeFi investor, we can see also kind of exactly what's happening with these protocols on the back end, almost as if we could with, FTX, in this light. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've been working hard at. A few months ago, we published a blog post on actually for DAOs, 10 tips in a bear market, and we really wanted to. We touched on a lot of the points that you just talked about, but also, we have unfortunately, when we've approached DAOs, also been met with resistance, ironically, by some. They don't want to, they didn't want to sell their token, or they were too busy with other priorities, or just couldn't get the discussion moving in their forums moving forward, and so a lot of the discussion stalled at some point. I think those projects will wish they had paid more attention now, but shoulda, woulda, coulda doesn't help anyone. For those who survive, they'll be smarter next time around, and but yeah, that's absolutely what we're trying to do. That's exactly what we're trying to promote. We've helped, with Nexus Mutual. We've helped with Unslash Finance. We're working with Human DAO. We're working with, we worked with FWB DAO. They retracted a bit because of the market conditions. They wanted to go into cash, but a lot of, we are seeing much more traction for this radical transparency. And I think that the people who lead the way, will set the example for the others as well.
Cool. And then we have one more question down the front.
I'd like to return to the discussion about whether regulation is needed or not. Almost broke out into an argument. So, I guess to paraphrase, all the information is available on the DeFi protocols or technologies, and users should assess their own risk. I'd argue that the average retail investor can't assess their own risk, right? So should there be an equivalent of like a sophisticated investor type, if investing in traditional assets, or is there no regulation, or is there regulation? I'd like to return to that point, really.
I mean, I think the current regulation, if it's applied to crypto and to blockchain the way it's being applied at the moment, I think it just breaks it, right? So I don't think the two things you can't get the benefits of Web3 and blockchain with current regulation. So I think the whole thing just needs thinking through, like, what's the minimum you can apply, what's really needed so that people have the information to be able to act safely, right? So, do projects need to, have certain data available? I don't know. I'm just, almost thinking out loud, right? But there's certain ways of projects presenting things or data being available and presented to your average user that they can understand the risks, because the data is there, the transparency is there.
I mean, I don't have a strong opinion about whether we should or shouldn't have regulation, but I will say, we haven't had any good crypto regulation. It's all been stupid, and I don't trust them to make the right regulation. They seem wouldn't it be great? I would rather have regulation that exchanges should have proof of reserves, but no, we have regulation that exchanges have to do intense KYC and stuff like that. That doesn't really ultimately benefit anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'll defend my point. On the point of retail investors, though, I think there's always retail investors wherever you are in centralized finance and decentralized finance, and I think those guys are best served by investment advisors or someone in the middle that plays the role of educating and helping them make the right decisions. The problem is even investment advisors can't make sensible advisory decisions if they don't have transparency. And we saw that in the example of FTX, as soon as the balance sheet was made available or leaked, people figured it out very quickly, and it spread across the internet within, hours, days, minutes, and pretty much everybody knew what was going on because there was that transparency. And so I guess my point is not necessarily that there should be no regulation and that even the retail person should make their own decision, but that, DeFi is a radical transparency enables people to make better decisions across the chain, and that those decisions usually spread. That becomes advice, that becomes that lead. People talk about that, and people get exposed. Bad actors get exposed much quicker, and potentially save much bigger losses than if you can't see what's going on.
I think that's it. Thank you guys. Can everyone give our panel a round of applause?